Recording started.
Okay, so we're still working on talking about some important European developments and thinking about the origins of the Restoration movement. Don't forget that the first reflection paper is due on Friday. So again, you only have to do 4 out of 5, so if you don't want to do that first one, that's fine. But that first one is due on Friday. So where we ended last Thursday was talking about some of the developments in England, specifically in the context of the Reformation. And we ended with talking about the rise of James I, who becomes both King of England and King of Scotland. And there are a lot of things that we could say about religion under James I, but essentially there are a couple of things. First of all is his opposition to basically any forms of religion except for the Church of England. So he's against Catholicism, which is understandable since a couple of Catholics tried to blow up Parliament. So it could be understood why he would be anti-Catholic. He's also against Puritanism, and particularly felt Puritans were too dogmatic in trying to purify the church. They're rejecting a lot of the teachings of the Church of England, and so just like Elizabeth I, who thought that religious dissidents would eventually become political dissidents, James does as well. This causes some of those Puritans to move to the Netherlands and then eventually to Massachusetts, where they will establish Plymouth Plantation. That's the group of people that are often referred to as the Pilgrims. The other thing, of course, we remember James for in our context is the development of the King James Version, the authorized version of the Bible. Essentially, he is trying to he's encouraging a translation of the Scriptures that would correct some of the errors of previous translations in English. And so he wanted to have an authorized version of English, of the English translation of Scripture. But in doing that, there were a couple of things that James also emphasized. Particularly, it was that there would be things in that version that would support the Episcopal version of government, the Church of England government, so that the use of church instead of congregation for ecclesia, the use of the term bishop instead of something like overseer. All of these were attempted to kind of emphasize the Church of England view as opposed to just translating it in the best way in English. The final publication of the authorized version came in 1611, and of course, even today, the King James Version maintains itself as a popular translation of Scripture for a lot of people. Eventually, James I died, and his son Charles I became king. A couple of things that are important for him as well is during Charles's rule that a larger group of Puritans will leave and form Massachusetts Bay, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so there's still this conflict between the Puritans and the Crown. There are also some conflicts between Parliament and Charles I, particularly because he marries a Catholic who is the daughter of the French king, and so there's a lot of concern about what's that going to mean for the heir, since a lot of Parliament was Protestant. So these tensions between Catholic and Protestant ultimately winding up into a civil war between Charles and Parliament that ends when Charles is beheaded. After Charles's reign, there is a kind of a government that's set up that's not a monarchy. The monarchy is abolished, and for a decade or so, there is for about a decade, there is a again, the emphasis is more on Parliament. But eventually, the monarchy is restored. But in all of this, there is still this concern about Catholic control of the monarchy, what that would mean, and so you have people going back and forth to the colonies because of that. Eventually, after the rule of a Catholic monarch named James II, another group comes into power, the monarchy of William and Mary, and they established the Act of Toleration, which essentially gave all non-Catholic Protestants freedom of worship. So if you were not a member of the Church of England, yet you were still a Protestant, often these groups were called dissenters or nonconformists because they did not conform to the teaching of the Anglican Church or the Church of England. And so that again emphasized the importance of Protestantism not only in England but its colonies. And also at the time, a rule was passed that only a Protestant could become the next monarch in England, which would down the line mean that there would be a German king on the English, or a German individual on the English throne, because he was actually the closest Protestant in line. Even though if you ignored that, he was actually 52nd in line for the throne. But because of him being the closest Protestant, he's the one that becomes the King of England.
Who was that?
It's George I, and he is from Germany. But this is later on down the line. We'll turn from England to talking about some developments in Scotland, because the Reformation in England is important because it sets the stage for the colonies and then America. But Scotland is important as well because that is where the rise of Presbyterianism, which is what Barton W. Stone comes out of, as well as the Campbells, and they are influenced by a Scottish or Scots-Irish type of Presbyterianism, or that's what they grow up in or are a part of before they decide to move to the restoration of the church. In Scotland, it's important to see the influence of Calvinism. There had been Protestants in Scotland very early on in the 1500s, some of them influenced by John Wycliffe, others of them following after the teachings of Martin Luther. And the monarchs in Scotland, who were still Catholic at the time, often tried to get rid of these individuals, but they just couldn't get rid of them. The type of Protestantism, though, that tended to be more popular in Scotland was that shaped by John Calvin as opposed to that by Martin Luther, particularly due to the work of John Knox. Knox had studied theology and become a priest, but had come to know a Protestant preacher who ended up being a martyr. And so Knox becomes very interested in Protestantism, having seen this individual's faith even in the face of death. And so he becomes a Protestant preacher. But that will lead him into trouble with the monarchy in Scotland, which is still very Catholic. He becomes a preacher to a community, Protestant community there, but in one of the castles, and the Scottish government will storm the castle, and Knox will be sentenced to hard labor for some time. England, however, will eventually intervene in all of this, and Knox will go to England and will begin to preach. But when Mary Tudor becomes the daughter of Henry VIII, becomes queen, he is one of those individuals that go to Geneva, where he is influenced by John Calvin and shaped by a lot of those things. Like other Protestants, when Elizabeth ascends to the throne, a lot of those Protestants that had escaped from England and Scotland get back. But in Scotland, there is opposition to the Queen Mother because of her anti-Protestant policies. And out of this, his frustration with Mary Tudor, his difficulties with Elizabeth I, as well as with the Queen Mother in Scotland, Knox writes some documents that are very, very oppositional to women rulers. And so this is a very harsh thing about women in general, but particularly in women rulers. However, Elizabeth does support the Scottish Protestants, which will eventually overthrow the Scottish Catholic rule, and in 1560, Calvinistic Protestantism becomes the official religion of Scotland. But through the shaping of Knox, it's not just Calvinism, it's really the origins of Presbyterianism. Knox and his followers organized the Reformed Church of England, the Reformed Church of Scotland, which becomes the official state church. And each church was to be led by a minister and a group of elders. The word for elder in the Greek New Testament was presbyteros, and so because each congregation is ruled by elders, it becomes known as a Presbyterian form of government. So the Presbyterian church, each of the congregations was governed by local leadership, but congregations were collected in various regional groups which also had a board of leaders, and so they were often referred to as synods, and then at a lot higher level there were presbyteries. So it was hierarchical, so it's not autonomous in structure, even though there is local leadership in each of the church. Which of course led to struggles between Scottish people who preferred the bishop form as well as those that supported the Presbyterian form. And additionally, there are troubles with England and Scotland. Since James I, the crown had been united because James VI of Scotland became James I of England. But as each new ruler came up, the parliaments of both Scotland and England had to agree to who would be the heir. Well, when Queen Anne, who was the daughter of William and Mary, when she dies childless. So the question becomes, who's to be the next heir? So England quite quickly selects Sophia of Hanover, who was the granddaughter of James I. Right? So she's in line for the throne. She's Protestant, so they select her. Scotland's Parliament, however, isn't too interested yet to select Sophia. So there's a lot of back and forth. Eventually, though, they come to an agreement, because the concern of Scotland is that here they are a Presbyterian in government, but England is Episcopal. Right? The Church of England has bishops, priests, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so the fear is that England is going to try and enforce Episcopal forms of government on Scotland, which is favoring Presbyterianism. So eventually the two countries agree that that there would not be an attempt to force Scottish Presbyterians to become Anglican. And so in the Act of Union that unites these, each of those would remain, so Scotland would remain Presbyterian, the Church of England would remain Episcopal. However, it's the same ruler, whether it's a king or queen, who's over Scotland or England. And so in England, she's thought of as, the current monarch, Elizabeth II, is thought of as Anglican, but when she's in Scotland, she's thought of as being a Presbyterian. I don't know how that all works, but that's the way it is, because she's thought of as, when she crosses the border, she changes religions. Now, of course, there's been in recent years push from Scotland to try and declare their independence, so if they ever get enough people to agree to that, there'll be a question about that as well. So, Sophia dies actually before becoming the queen. And so she dies before Anne. When Anne dies, George the First of Hanover of Germany, as I mentioned, will become the heir. And so there's a unified crown still. Eventually Ireland is wrapped into all of that, and it becomes known as the Great Britain, the United Kingdom. However, Presbyterianism in Scotland is becoming more secular at the time. A lot of the Presbyterians are kind of splitting between those that are being influenced by secular types of thought and those that are more traditional, or sometimes referred to as evangelical Presbyterians, those that are holding on to the traditional gospel. Now, the majority is largely this traditional evangelical Presbyterianism. But the General Assembly, which was the top of the Presbyterian hierarchy, becomes more moderate and starts making claims that it should be the ones to decide who the ministers in local churches should be. And out of that, a group breaks off. It secedes from the General Assembly. It becomes known as the Secession Church. And becomes very popular, but eventually the Secession Church, or the seceders, would break off again, or would divide again, over a question of municipal officials. So there's a law passed that says that municipal officials, elected leaders, had to support the religion of the region whether they agreed with it or not. And some people felt that this was coercion, that you're forced to support something you don't believe in. And so it divided between those that supported the oath and those that didn't support the oath. Then there would be a later division over whether or not to make agreement to a treaty between England and Scotland a matter of communion or not. So if you agree that you have to agree to this document or you're not going to be a faithful Presbyterian, and then there were others that said no, you shouldn't have to agree with it. So there's a division between old lights and new lights.